Hello everyone, welcome back to the Velvet Mamas.
Miss Marple and the Girl Who Wrote Her Will in Chalk. Chapter 1. The Anniversary and the Collapse. The morning fog still lingered in the hollows of Wilmor Hollow when Miss Marple arrived at the village school, her umbrella tucked neatly beneath her arm. The school had not opened its gates for years, not since the last pupils had left, and the iron bell above the entry arch had rung one final time. Today, however, the bell had been polished. Garlands of marigolds and ivy curled up its post. The entire village had gathered. It was the school's 150th anniversary. The front lawn, though damp underfoot, had been swept clean. Children, some in uniform and others in Sunday coats, ran along the gravel path. Elderly villagers sat on folding chairs beneath a canvas awning, nursing cups of lukewarm tea. And at the centre of it all, Clara Brinley stood with a clipboard in hand and a flushed but determined look on her face. Miss Marple watched her for a moment. Clara was a neat young woman with a soft voice and a habit of biting her lip when deep in thought. She had returned to the village only 2 months earlier, after the death of her great-aunt, Miss Letty Brinley, who had been the school's long-serving headmistress. Clara had taken over the school's affairs, or what little remained of them, and was the driving force behind today's reopening ceremony. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Clara called cheerfully, waving across the grass. "So glad you could come." Miss Marple stepped forward with a smile. "How could I resist? A schoolhouse always holds such memories, chalk dust, damp cloaks and mischief." Clara laughed softly. "Let's hope today is more celebratory than mischievous." She turned back to her guests, ushering them gently inside the schoolroom, where rows of wooden desks had been polished to a sheen. The walls were lined with faded drawings, framed certificates and photographs, including a large black and white print of the very first class, dating back to 1875. A blackboard dominated the far wall. On it, someone had written in precise script, "Wilmor Hollow School, 150 years of learning." Miss Marple found a seat near the back. She was quietly observant, as always. A few names floated through her mind as she looked around the room. Mr. Hugh Brinley, Clara's distant cousin, stood near the door, sipping his tea far too quickly. Elsa, the former art teacher who had been dismissed under rather vague circumstances, was flicking imaginary dust from her sleeve. A pale girl with a plait down her back, Jenny, she believed, hovered beside the window, her eyes fixed nervously on Clara. Clara moved to the blackboard, holding a fresh stick of chalk in her right hand. She smiled at the group, her face suddenly more solemn. "Before we begin," she said quietly, "I wanted to share something personal." The room fell still. Clara turned toward the board and began to write. "She's alive, but barely. We must get her to the clinic, now. Everything must go to—" She paused. A strange expression passed over her face. Not pain, exactly, but a kind of faltering. Her hand dropped to her side. The chalk slipped from her fingers and clinked against the wooden floor. She said faintly, and then she collapsed. A gasp moved through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. Several people surged forward. Mr. Brinley caught her before she hit the floor, calling her name in alarm. A woman near the window screamed. Jenny pressed herself into the corner, eyes wide. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands gently folded on her handbag. She had seen Clara's face as she fell. Not contorted, not stricken with pain, but startled, as though betrayed by something within her own body. "Someone fetch Dr. Everley," someone cried. "Already gone for him," another shouted from the hall. Within minutes, the room had emptied, save for a few who stayed to fan Clara with a folded paper programme. Her eyes remained closed. Her breathing was shallow. Dr. Everly arrived, red-faced and brisk, his leather bag swinging from one hand. He knelt beside Clara, examined her quickly, then looked up at the room. Miss Marple stood and stepped quietly into the hallway. The air outside was fresher. She noticed, as she passed the blackboard again, that someone had wiped it clean. The words Clara had begun to write were gone. She paused. A single streak of white chalk remained, faint, angled, nearly invisible unless you looked closely. A smudge, a trace. Why would someone wipe it? She turned her head slowly, watching the people bustling past in confusion. There had been no reason to clean the board. Not yet. Not unless someone wished to remove something Clara had written, or was about to write. 10 minutes later, the ambulance pulled away. Clara, still unconscious, was taken to the clinic. The guests began to disperse, some in quiet tears, others muttering confusion and dread. Miss Marple remained behind, standing beside the desk where Clara had sat just an hour earlier. She looked at the blackboard again, thoughtful. Her fingertips brushed the edge of the teacher's table where the chalk tray still held a broken stick, freshly snapped. From the doorway, the caretaker, Mr. Dunn, called out, "All right, Miss Marple? Shall I lock up now?" She smiled gently. "Yes, Mr. Dunn, though I expect we'll all be back sooner than we think." And as she stepped outside, the clouds shifted overhead. A gust of wind stirred the marigolds near the bell. The celebration had ended, and something far darker had begun. Chapter 2. Whispers and White Marks. The morning after the school's anniversary, a hush had settled over Wilmor Hollow. The bunting that had fluttered so cheerily yesterday now hung limp in the light drizzle. Outside the post office, 2 villagers stood under a narrow awning speaking in low voices. Rumours, like autumn leaves, drifted across the village lanes. Clara Brinley had not woken. Miss Marple, dressed in a dove-grey coat and simple hat, walked briskly toward the bakery, where she often picked up news along with her bread. She passed Mr. Hugh Brinley, who stood frowning into his cup outside the tea room. He didn't greet her, but she noticed his fingers trembled slightly as he raised the saucer to his lips. At the bakery counter, Mrs. Penfold offered a tight-lipped smile. "Strange business yesterday," she murmured, wrapping up a half-loaf. "The poor girl, so young too." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, and just as she was about to say something important, Mrs. Penfold blinked. "Was she?" "She wrote, 'Everything must go too' on the chalkboard," Miss Marple replied mildly. "And then she fell. I remember that quite clearly, but the board was wiped clean not 5 minutes later." Mrs. Penfold tilted her head, uncertain. "I didn't see anyone wipe it." "Nor did I," said Miss Marple, "but someone did, quietly, while everyone rushed to Clara's side." She paid for the bread and left. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way back to the schoolhouse. It remained closed, the gate latched, and the windows dark. But the caretaker, Mr. Dunn, was pottering about the side garden, pulling up soggy banners and swearing gently under his breath. "Mr. Dunn," she called pleasantly, "might I trouble you for a moment?" He turned, startled, then nodded. "Miss Marple, if it's about the school, I've orders not to open until the trustees say so." "Oh, I've no wish to intrude," she assured him. "I only wanted to ask, do you recall anyone cleaning the blackboard after Clara collapsed?" He scratched his head beneath his flat cap. "Not I, ma'am. I locked up after the ambulance left, of course. But as for wiping the board, no, I don't believe I saw anyone do that." She narrowed her eyes slightly. "And did you happen to notice a girl standing near the window, long plait, pale face?" "Jenny," he said immediately. "Quiet little thing, Lives with a vicar, I think. She was there, right enough. Seemed shaken. Thank you, Miss Marple said warmly. That's most helpful. Miss Marple didn't walk directly to the vicarage. Instead, she took a long, slow route through the village, passing the church, the war memorial, and the playground where rusted swings creaked in the wind. The drizzle had thinned, leaving the hedges sparkling and the air cool. At the vicarage gate, she paused. It was a cheerful building, ivy-covered and well-kept, but today it felt subdued. Reverend Falk answered the door himself, wearing a cardigan and a concerned expression. Miss Marple, he said, do come in. I suppose this is about poor Clara. Indeed, she replied. Might I speak with Jenny just briefly? I won't trouble her long. He hesitated, then nodded. She hasn't spoken much since yesterday. Very upset. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way back to the schoolhouse. It remained closed, the gate latched, and the windows dark. But the caretaker, Mr. Dunn, was pottering about the side garden, pulling up soggy banners and swearing gently under his breath. Mr. Dunn, she called pleasantly. Might I trouble you for a moment? He turned, startled, then nodded. Miss Marple, if it's about the school, I've orders not to open until the trustees say so. Oh, I've no wish to intrude, she assured him. I only wanted to ask, do you recall anyone cleaning the blackboard after Clara collapsed? He scratched his head beneath his flat cap. Not I, ma'am. I locked up after the ambulance left, of course. But as for wiping the board, no, I don't believe I saw anyone do that. She narrowed her eyes slightly. And did you happen to notice a girl standing near the window, long plait, pale face? Jenny, he said immediately. Quiet little thing. Lives with a vicar, I think. She was there, right enough. Seemed shaken. Thank you, Miss Marple said warmly. That's most helpful. Miss Marple didn't walk directly to the vicarage. Instead, she took a long, slow route through the village, passing the church, the war memorial, and the playground where rusted swings creaked in the wind. The drizzle had thinned, leaving the hedges sparkling and the air cool. At the vicarage gate, she paused. It was a cheerful building, ivy-covered and well-kept, but today it felt subdued. Reverend Falk answered the door himself, wearing a cardigan and a concerned expression. Miss Marple, he said, do come in. I suppose this is about poor Clara. Indeed, she replied. Might I speak with Jenny just briefly? I won't trouble her long. He hesitated, then nodded. She hasn't spoken much since yesterday. Very upset. He led Miss Marple into a modest parlour where Jenny sat curled in a high-backed chair, her eyes red. A book lay closed in her lap, untouched. Jenny, Miss Marple said gently, I wonder if you might help me understand something. Yesterday, when Clara went to the blackboard, did you see what she wrote? Jenny nodded faintly. Do you remember the words? Everything must go to, she murmured. And then she dropped the chalk. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. And did you see who cleaned the board? Jenny's fingers twisted in her lap. She looked at the floor. I think I did, she whispered. But I'm not sure I should say. Miss Marple gave her a kind smile. Sometimes saying what we saw helps someone who's been hurt. Clara might not have meant to fall, you see. Something might have caused it. Jenny swallowed. It was Mr. Slate, the man with the grey coat. He walked over to the board. I thought he was helping, but then I saw him wipe it with his handkerchief. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Are you certain? Jenny nodded more firmly this time. He didn't know I was watching. That evening, Miss Marple took tea at home and wrote several notes in her diary. Beside her sat a small stack of documents, yesterday's programme, a copy of the guest list, and a press clipping about the school's reopening. Among the guests listed, Neville Slate stood out, a property developer from out of town, rumoured to be courting the trustees about redeveloping the site. She placed a pencil tick beside his name. Before bed, Miss Marple folded her shawl and looked out at the village square. All appeared quiet. But she felt something rising. Not panic, not yet, but a faint ripple of unease. Clara's collapse had not been random, nor had the disappearance of her final words. Someone had wiped them away, and perhaps not because they were unimportant, but because they mattered far too much. Miss Marple turned down the lamp. Tomorrow, she thought, would bring questions. But tonight she had enough to wonder about. Chapter 3. The Ghost in the Guestbook. The morning sun streamed across Miss Marple's breakfast table, glinting off the rim of her silver teaspoon. The village paper lay folded beside her cup. The headline was modest but unsettling. School ceremony ends in sudden collapse. Miss Clara Brinley in critical condition. Beneath it was a photograph taken just before the event. Clara smiled at the camera, a string of ivy looped behind her like a garland. To the left, half cut from frame, stood a man in a grey coat. Tall, unsmiling, a blur of movement caught in the background. Miss Marple turned to the second column. The reporter listed those in attendance, taken from the official guest book. She skimmed the names: Hugh Brinley, Elsa Vale, Reverend Falk, Miss Jenny Falk, Mr. Neville Slate. Her brow creased. The article named only 11 confirmed guests inside the schoolroom at the time of the incident. But Miss Marple distinctly remembered 12 chairs set in a semicircle. One had been placed awkwardly near the blackboard, the same chair Clara had turned towards when she'd picked up the chalk. Someone had been sitting in it. Someone not accounted for. By 10 o'clock, she had walked down to the school again. It remained locked, but Miss Marple had already anticipated that. Instead, she knocked on the heavy green door of the school's archive office next door, which housed old records, minute books, and event planning files. Mrs. Adele Grangemore answered. The former deputy headmistress had retired years ago, but still managed the school's legacy archive with a possessive fondness. "Well," she said, not bothering to smile. "You're not here for library cards, I imagine?" "No," Miss Marple said, unfazed. "I was wondering if the guest book from the anniversary might still be on the premises." Mrs. Grangemore looked doubtful. "Police took most of the recent items, but I may have a photocopy. We had it on display yesterday to remind people of who'd contributed." She shuffled away behind a filing cabinet and returned with a thin binder. "Here." Miss Marple thanked her and took the pages outside to the stone bench under the beech tree. There were 12 names listed. She read them slowly. 11 matched the news report. The 12th name, written in hurried, narrow script, simply read, B. Rose. No title. No location. No identifying note. She frowned. Rose was not a name familiar to Wilmor Hollow. It did not appear on the fate committee lists, the church register, or the village shop records, at least none that Miss Marple could recall. Yet the name had clearly been added in Clara's handwriting, and rather last minute. Curious. Later that day, Miss Marple made her way to the village inn, where several of the out-of-town guests had been staying. The innkeeper, Mr. Larch, recognized her at once and motioned her into the sitting room. "Anything I can help you with, Miss Marple?" She smiled gently. "I wonder if a Mr. or Ms. B. Rose checked in here this week?" Mr. Larch scratched his head. "Rose? No, doesn't ring a bell. Let me check the ledger." He disappeared behind the counter, and Miss Marple listened to the soft clink of glass from the kitchen. A fire snapped in the grate, the only sound in the quiet room. He returned with a thin logbook and laid it open. "There," he pointed. "Room 4 was booked 2 nights ago. Just BR. No full name given. Paid in cash. Checked out early this morning, before breakfast. Left no forwarding address." Miss Marple leaned forward. The signature was barely a scrawl, but someone had pressed too hard. She could see the faint imprint of a line written above it. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a soft pencil. "Would you mind if I do a quick shading?" she asked. He nodded, intrigued. She laid a blank sheet gently over the impression and rubbed the pencil across the page in light, smooth strokes. Gradually the indentation revealed itself. "For the truth, meet me by the ledger at dawn." She stared at it in silence. The ledger. Clara's school ledger or something else? That evening, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the vicarage. Reverend Falk welcomed her in with his usual warmth, though the tension in his brow had deepened. "She's still unconscious," he said without prompting. "They say it's a matter of time now. Either she wakes, or she doesn't." Miss Marple placed her gloves in her lap. "Has anything gone missing from her belongings?" He blinked. "I couldn't say. The police have her flat sealed." "Do you know if Clara kept a second set of records? A ledger, perhaps?" The vicar frowned. There was an old staff ledger. Her great-aunt used to write everything in it. Salaries, discipline notes, odd bits. Clara kept it behind the headmistress's desk, I believe. "Why?" "'Cause someone wanted to meet her by it," Miss Marple said softly. And now Clara cannot speak at all. She stood. "I believe I must find that ledger before someone else does." By moonlight, the schoolhouse stood silent. But Miss Marple had not come unprepared. She returned early the next morning, just as the sun broke over the trees, casting long shadows across the school lawn. The caretaker's gate had been left ajar. The classroom door was unlocked. She stepped quietly inside. The room smelled of chalk and cold wood. The blackboard was still clean, the desk untouched. She moved to the cupboard behind the teacher's chair. Inside, tucked behind a stack of hymnals, she found it, a leather-bound book with a brass clasp, slightly cracked with age. She opened it gently. Inside were the records of the school, written in neat, sloping hand. But the last 2 pages had been torn out. Cleanly, deliberately. And whoever had taken them had not done so for nostalgia. Miss Marple closed the ledger and held it tightly. There was someone in Wilmor Hollow who wanted Clara silenced. And perhaps, for the moment, they had succeeded. But Miss Marple was listening, and she had heard more than they knew. Chapter 4. Behind the painting. It was still early when Miss Marple left the school, the torn ledger pressed firmly beneath her coat. The streets of Wilmor Hollow remained quiet, save for the occasional clatter of milk bottles and the distant hum of a lorry climbing the hill. She walked, without haste, allowing her thoughts to settle into their usual methodical rhythm. 2 pages had been torn from the school's oldest ledger, likely the final entries Clara ever made. It was not a random act. Someone had searched for those pages. Someone had found them before her. But what could Clara have recorded that made her a threat? And what did she mean to say, scrawling, "Everything must go to beats on the blackboard"? By mid-morning, Miss Marple was seated at the vicarage once more, this time with Jenny Falk by her side. The girl was quiet but attentive, her fingers tracing the edge of a teacup without lifting it. "Jenny," Miss Marple said gently, "when you were helping Clara prepare the schoolroom, did she mention anyone unusual visiting her recently?" Jenny glanced up, eyes uncertain. "There was a woman," she said softly. "Dark hair. She came in while I was cleaning the windows." Clara didn't introduce her. They went into the headmistress's room and closed the door. "Do you recall anything about her?" Jenny shook her head. Only her voice. She didn't sound local, but Clara. She was crying when the woman left. I asked if she was all right. She said she was just remembering something, that's all. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Later that day, she visited the old Brinley cottage on the edge of the village. Clara had been living there since her great-aunt's passing. The gate squeaked as she pushed it open. Ivy climbed the stone walls and a thin line of smoke curled from the chimney. Not from the hearth, but from a smouldering bin near the garden. The door was locked, but she was expected. Detective Sergeant Crail opened it with a sigh. A lean man with a slight stoop and no fondness for interruptions, he barely concealed his disapproval. "I was told you might stop by, Miss Marple." "And you were told I might notice what others miss." He offered a tight smile. "Can't argue with that, but do keep your visit brief." Miss Marple entered. The front room was small and orderly. A few photographs lined the mantel. Clara as a child beside her great-aunt, a school field trip, a faded image of Clara holding a baby. She stepped closer. The baby's face was obscured, torn deliberately from the photograph, as if erased. "Do you mind if I look in the headmistress's study?" she asked politely. Crail hesitated, then motioned toward the far door. The study was dim and smelled faintly of camphor and dust. A large oak desk stood at its center, its surface clean, its drawers empty. Along the back wall hung a portrait of Miss Letty Brinley in academic robes. Stiff-backed, cold-eyed, Miss Marple walked to the corner cabinet and opened it. Inside were rows of old school ledgers and reports, most untouched for years. Then she noticed something curious. The portrait above the fireplace was slightly askew. She stepped closer and touched the frame. It shifted easily, revealing a small cavity in the plaster behind it. Inside lay two items, a folded piece of paper and a black and white photograph. The photograph, though faded, was unmistakable. It was the same baby from the torn family photo, but this time intact. A girl, perhaps a few months old, swaddled in a woolen blanket. The handwriting on the back read, "Iris, Icky bin dirt." The paper was a draft of a will, dated only 3 weeks ago. In Clara's handwriting, "I leave the Brinley cottage and all contents as well as rights to the Wilmor Hollow school property to Iris Pentlow, my biological daughter, born 2004. My wish is that she inherit what is rightfully hers." Miss Marple read the lines twice, her expression calm but focused. So, Clara had a daughter. And not just a daughter, one named as her heir. She folded the paper carefully and returned it to her handbag. Back in the village square, she watched the comings and goings with narrowed eyes. She had not heard the name Iris Pentlow until the day of the anniversary, and yet there she was, a young woman barely 20, introduced as an old pupil of the school, attending the celebration with polite detachment and very little to say. But Clara's will named her as next of kin, which meant Clara had never told anyone, not even the vicar nor Jenny, the truth. Iris was her daughter. Illegitimate, perhaps, hidden from society, and now the unexpected heir to two valuable properties. Miss Marple sat quietly on a bench outside the church and considered the implications. If Clara had intended to declare Iris her daughter in public, and had begun to do so on the chalkboard, then someone had a very good reason to stop her. And perhaps an even better reason to destroy those last 2 pages in the ledger. Someone who had something to lose. That evening, the fog rolled back in, curling around the school gates like breath on a mirror. Miss Marple walked alone along the footpath that led behind the church, pausing beside the old school annex, now used for storage. The door creaked as she pushed it open. Inside, among broken chairs and dusty books, she found what she was looking for: a stack of yearbooks and class photographs. She flipped through the most recent ones, eyes scanning names. There, in the 2014 page, was Iris. Not Pentlow, then, just Iris Brinley, listed quietly among the students. No parents named, no notes beside her name, hidden in plain sight. She stood for a long moment, the book open in her hands, the air thick with silence. Then she closed it. There was a child born in secrecy, a mother who wanted to make things right, a will written too late, and someone who wanted the past to remain buried. Miss Marple now had a name, a motive, and the faintest shadow of a plan. But the danger was no longer in uncovering the truth. The danger, she knew, was in what others would do to keep it hidden. Chapter 5. Scratches and Secrets. The morning air was cool and sharp, heavy with the scent of wood smoke and the distant promise of rain. Miss Marple sat on her garden bench, a thick wool shawl wrapped over her shoulders, the remains of her breakfast cooling beside her. Spread across her lap was the 2014 school yearbook. Her gloved fingertip hovered over the photograph of a group of girls from Class B. Second row, third from the left, Iris Brinley. A quiet smile, neatly plaited hair. No parents listed in the side note, unlike the others. Beside her, another girl's face had been deliberately scratched out, not by the printer's hand, but violently, by someone who had used pressure, deep enough to tear the page beneath. It hadn't been like that in the original print, Miss Marple was certain. This particular copy had been kept in Clara's cottage. That meant Clara, or someone close to her, had destroyed the image. But why? Who was the girl, and what had she done to deserve being erased? At the vicarage, Jenny answered the door in a wool cardigan 2 sizes too big, and eyes slightly pink from crying. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Jenny, dear, I was wondering if you might recognize someone for me." She held out the yearbook. Jenny took it, flipping through the pages absently until her gaze caught the scratched-out photo. She stilled. "I remember her," she said after a long pause. "Do you remember her name?" Jenny nodded slowly. "Celia. Celia Pentlow. She was older than me. Came to the school just for a year, then left." Miss Marple kept her expression neutral. "Pentlow?" "Yes. Iris's sister, or cousin. They lived together, but no parents. Just a foster carer who worked up near the railway line." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did Clara Brinley teach either of them?" Jenny hesitated. "She ran art classes in the summer back then. That's when she knew them." There was a pause. "I think something happened," Jenny added quietly. "One day Celia didn't come back. Iris didn't talk about it, not ever. Then Clara stopped smiling the same way." By mid-morning, Miss Marple was seated across from Inspector Redburn in the parish office. He was a precise man in shirt sleeves, with a clipped moustache and a deep reluctance to be drawn into what he termed unfinished gossip. "Celia Pentlow," Miss Marple said gently, "was listed in the 2014 school records. Foster child, gone after a year." Redburn frowned. That was a juvenile protection case, off-limits, even to retired sleuths with knitting baskets. "I don't knit nearly as much as people suppose," she replied with a faint smile, "though I do notice when girls disappear and no one seems to mention them again." He shifted uncomfortably. "The Pentlow case was messy. Not criminal as far as I recall. Celia ran away, that was the report. From school? Number from her foster home. Vanished in the middle of the night. No luggage, no contact since." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And Iris?" "Remained in care. Quiet girl. Bit nervous. went on to further study somewhere in the north. Under her own name, Redburn looked hesitant. There were adjustments. Paperwork was vague. There was no official adoption. She likely changed her name later. We stopped keeping close tabs once she turned 18. Miss Marple sipped her tea. And yet she returned, quietly, to attend the anniversary. As Iris Pentlow, Redburn's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting Iris had something to do with Clara Brinley's collapse? I'm suggesting that Clara knew more than she let on, and that her final message, everything must go to, may not have been legal instruction at all. Perhaps it was a confession. That afternoon, Miss Marple went to the churchyard, where the light filtered through the tall oaks and the air was hushed. She carried a small envelope. Inside were 2 photographs, one of Clara and baby Iris, and the other, half-torn, of Iris and Celia, together at the edge of the school garden. Both images had been found tucked inside a hollowed book in Clara's bedroom. Not hidden well, not forgotten either. She placed the photographs on the stone bench beside her, watching the shadows stretch. The theory was forming now. Clara had a child, Iris. She kept her hidden, perhaps even from the Brinley family. Whether Iris had been placed into care voluntarily or through some coercion was still unclear. Celia Pentlow, possibly Iris's foster sibling or half-sister, had vanished 10 years ago. Iris returned to Wilmor Hollow shortly before Clara's collapse, attending the event under a name that hadn't been used in years, and someone, somewhere, had gone to great effort to erase Celia's memory. Miss Marple had known such cases before, families torn by shame, secrets buried too deeply, truths re-emerging like roots through stone. She gathered the photographs and stood. It was time to visit Iris. The door to the guest house opened with a hesitant creak. Iris stood in the doorway, wearing a navy jumper and jeans, her face pale, her eyes wide and watchful. "You remember me?" Miss Marple said softly. Iris nodded. "I'd like to speak with you about Clara, about what she was trying to tell us." Iris looked behind her, perhaps to check if anyone else had followed, then stepped aside. They sat in a quiet lounge with drawn curtains and a cold fireplace. Iris clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "I didn't know she was going to say anything," Iris said quickly. "She didn't tell me. I hadn't even planned to come until 2 days before." "You used the guestbook name, B. Rose." "I panicked," she admitted. "I hadn't been back to the village since I was 14. People still remember things." Miss Marple gave a gentle nod. "Did Clara tell you about the will?" Iris's face twisted. "She showed me a draft, said she'd make it official after the anniversary. She wanted to tell people about me, about Celia." Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "What happened to Celia, Iris?" Iris looked down, her voice brittle. "She found something out about where I really came from. She told Clara, and then she disappeared. No one came looking for her. No police, nothing. I think someone made sure she never told the rest." Miss Marple's voice was low. "Do you believe Clara was trying to right that wrong?" Iris nodded. "She said she owed us the truth, that she'd kept it buried too long." Miss Marple reached across and gently placed a hand over Iris's. "And someone, my dear, was willing to make sure that truth remained buried." Chapter 6. A cup not meant to be drunk. The morning sky was slate grey, the kind that made colours seem dull and the air feel heavier than it was. Miss Marple walked to the schoolhouse under a borrowed umbrella, the gravel path crunching softly beneath her shoes. The celebration banners had been removed, and the gate now bore a discreet notice: "School closed until further notice." She was expected. Detective Sergeant Crail greeted her with a nod. "You're becoming a fixture, Miss Marple." "I find persistence to be useful in many areas of life, Sergeant." He allowed himself a faint smile and led her into the schoolroom. "I've had the tea things brought in," he said. They'd been dusted for fingerprints. Nothing much except the teacher's cup. Clara's had only her own, no poison found in it. Miss Marple arched an eyebrow. "So she didn't drink any tea?" "Precisely. Her cup was full when we arrived, never touched. But the teapot itself, well..." He reached into a box and withdrew a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a small glass vial, only half full. "Traces of yew extract. We believe it was stirred into the pot shortly before serving." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "But if Clara didn't drink it?" "Someone else did," he said. "We just don't know who yet." He stiffened, but said nothing. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple reviewed her notes. She remembered watching the tea service that day with casual interest. There had been a long table laid at the side of the room with neatly labelled cups, each with a small name card. Clara had handed hers to the cook directly. The others had taken theirs at random, so the poisoned tea had not been aimed at a specific cup. It had been added to the pot, which meant the poisoner hadn't intended to kill Clara at all. They'd meant to poison whoever poured first, but Clara, absorbed in her speech and the chalkboard message, had never poured her tea. Someone else had. Miss Marple made a list. Of the 11 guests who drank that day, only a few had sipped before the incident, and one of them had fallen violently ill that very night. By noon, Miss Marple stood on the doorstep of the village inn, tapping lightly on the door to room 3. After a moment, it opened to reveal Mr. Hugh Brinley, still in his waistcoat, his eyes sunken, and his skin oddly pale. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said gently. He didn't bother to hide his irritation. "You usually are. I heard you were unwell the evening after the ceremony." He blinked, clearly thrown. "A touch of stomach trouble. Must have been something I ate." "Indeed. Perhaps something you drank. Tea can be quite treacherous when brewed with unfamiliar ingredients," Miss Marple said softly. "Yew leaves, for example, very toxic, and flavourless if steeped just right." He swallowed. "Are you suggesting I was poisoned?" "I'm suggesting that Clara Brinley wasn't." He hesitated. "Then who?" "You." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple met with Inspector Redburn at the station, where the test results from the local clinic had arrived. Hugh Brinley's illness was not indigestion as he claimed. It was subacute yew poisoning, low dose, but genuine. Had he consumed more, the effects might have been fatal. "So someone poisoned the teapot," Redburn muttered, rubbing his temple. "But Clara never drank any. Hugh did." Miss Marple nodded. "Which raises an essential question. Who knew that Clara wouldn't be pouring her own tea?" Redburn leaned back. "Only someone familiar with the ceremony schedule, someone who knew she'd be speaking just after the welcome." "Or someone who planned to stop her from speaking at all," Miss Marple added. Either way, Hugh Brinley was not the target, but the wrong person sipped the poisoned brew. At the cook's cottage that evening, Miss Marple sat across from Martha Wilkes, who looked flustered and defensive. "I didn't brew anything special, I swear it." Clara brought her own small tin of loose leaves, said she preferred her own blend. Lemon, dried mint, and something else I couldn't place. "Did you steep them separately?" Martha nodded. "I made her pot first, as she asked. The rest went in the large teapot for everyone else." "And when did she give you that tin?" 2 days before the event." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Was there ever a moment when the teapots were left unattended?" The cook shifted. "Briefly. After I set them out, I had to run back to the kitchen for more napkins. Maybe 3 minutes. The cups and pots were left on the tray. That was enough time. Someone could have slipped yew extract into the communal pot, and that someone had reason to believe Clara would drink first. But she hadn't. Hugh had, which meant the plan had failed. Clara collapsed not from poison, but from shock. Returning home, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk beneath the parlour window, the lamps casting warm pools of light across her notes. She read over the sequence once more. Clara brings her own tea leaves. The cook prepares 2 pots. Clara's separate, the guests shared. Poison is added to the communal pot. Hugh drinks, becomes ill that night. Clara collapses, but from emotional stress, not poison. Someone wipes the blackboard. 2 pages are torn from the ledger, and then she saw it. The key was not just in who drank, but in who didn't. Elsa Vale, the dismissed art teacher, had been present, but left early. She hadn't touched her cup, nor had she stayed to assist Clara. She had slipped away quietly before the ambulance arrived, and she had once been Clara's closest colleague. Miss Marple picked up her telephone and dialed the number to the inn. "Could you connect me to Miss Elsa Vale's room, please?" she asked. The reply came after a pause. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Miss Vale checked out early this morning, left no message." Miss Marple lowered the receiver gently, a chill settling across her chest. Elsa was gone. The poison had been misdelivered, and Clara's attempt to confess her truth had failed. But Miss Marple was no longer working with fragments. She now had a motive, a mistaken victim, and a suspect who had fled. And tomorrow she would begin drawing it all together, with a broken locket, a missing sibling, and a lie buried in chalk. Chapter 7. The Ink and the Locket. The following morning broke with a pale sky and a scent of dew rising from the hedgerows. Miss Marple sat by her front window watching as a postman cycled past, unaware that the events of Wilmor Hollow were quietly tipping from mystery into revelation. The newspaper lay on her table, folded to the obituary section. Clara Brinley remained in critical condition. No change, no voice to confirm what her chalk had tried to say. But Miss Marple didn't need her voice. She had seen enough, and now it was time to visit the final piece of the puzzle. At the village antiques shop, tucked between the butcher and the church, Miss Marple examined a tray of lockets laid carefully behind glass. Mr. Hemley, the shopkeeper, noticed her gaze. "Looking for something special?" he asked. Miss Marple nodded, pointing. "That gold oval locket, the one with the hinge slightly loose, did it come in recently?" "Yesterday morning, found in a donation box at the back door, no note, likely someone clearing out drawers after the school event." "May I see it?" He retrieved it and laid it in her palm. Miss Marple turned it gently. Inside the locket were 2 photographs, one of a young Clara, unmistakably mid-20s, with worry lines beginning at the corners of her mouth. The second, a girl with straight black hair, perhaps 10 years old, looking out with a faint, guarded smile. Etched faintly behind the image was a single name, Celia. Miss Marple's fingers closed slowly around the locket. Someone had removed it from Clara's things. Someone who feared it would tell a story they'd spent years trying to bury. Back at home, she unfolded the photographs she had collected. Clara and Iris as a baby, Iris and Celia, together, the yearbook. She compared each face with the one in the locket. Yes, the girl in the locket was Celia Pentlow, not a cousin, not just another foster child. Clara had raised her for years, possibly as her ward, perhaps even as her daughter, but then something changed. Celia vanished. Her name was erased from records, her image scratched from school photos. And in the end, all that remained was this locket, tossed in secret, like the final act of someone ashamed or afraid. Miss Marple lit the fire in her sitting room and watched the flames catch. The heat brought clarity. If Elsa Vale had indeed poisoned the tea, it had been an act of desperation, not strategy. She hadn't expected Clara to skip her drink, but more importantly, she hadn't expected Iris to return, because Elsa knew what happened to Celia, and what Clara had been preparing to reveal. By afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage. "I need your help," she told Reverend Falk. "And Jenny's." In the parlour, she laid the locket on the table between them. Jenny leaned forward, her eyes wide. "That's Celia," she said softly. "That's her." "She lived with Clara longer than anyone knew," Miss Marple explained. "When Iris arrived into care, Celia was the one who discovered the truth, that Clara was Iris's real mother, not merely a teacher or guardian." Reverend Falk's brow furrowed. "But how could that lead to all this?" "Because Clara had hidden both girls away from public knowledge," Miss Marple replied. "Celia grew old enough to ask questions, to want the truth. Perhaps she threatened to expose it, or perhaps she simply disappeared under suspicious circumstances." Reverend Falk looked stunned. "You believe she was—" Miss Marple did not answer directly. "I believe someone feared that Clara, after all these years, would bring it all to light, in writing, in speech, even in inheritance." She handed Jenny a photograph of Elsa Vale. "Did this woman ever argue with Clara?" Jenny hesitated. "Once, last year, I heard them shouting from the staff room. Clara told her to leave. Elsa slammed the door." "What was it about?" "Iris," Jenny said. "Elsa said Clara was making a mess again, that the girl had no claim. I didn't understand at the time." Miss Marple stood. "You've helped me more than you know." Just before dusk, Miss Marple visited the clinic. Clara still slept, unmoving, her chest rising and falling with mechanical rhythm. Her hand, thin and still, rested on the blanket. Miss Marple took it gently, her own hand soft with age but firm with intent. "You tried," she whispered. "You tried to speak the truth at last, and they stopped you. But it isn't too late." Behind her, the nurse entered quietly. "She stirred once this morning," the nurse said. "Just briefly, no words, but her fingers moved." Miss Marple nodded. "Hold on to that. She may yet speak again." But Miss Marple wasn't waiting any longer. The final piece was already in her pocket, a folded scrap of paper she'd recovered from Clara's fireplace. Barely legible, half-burnt, but unmistakable. "Everything must go to Iris. I could not save Celia. I let fear guide me once. I will not again." That night, the schoolroom sat silent under moonlight. But in Miss Marple's parlour, lights burned long into the evening as she prepared the next day's confrontation. She had a name. She had a motive. She had the truth. Scratched, buried, poisoned, and nearly erased. But she would uncover it, chalk and all. And in the final chapter, the drawing room would once again become a courtroom, not of law, but of truth. Chapter 8. The Chalked Confession. The schoolroom, quiet for days, had been opened once more under Inspector Redburn's authority. A fire was lit in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the worn floorboards. Chairs had been arranged in a semicircle. On the far wall, the blackboard stood clean, save for one freshly drawn line of white chalk. Everything must go to. Miss Marple stood beside it, one hand resting gently on the teacher's desk. Her expression was calm, but her voice, when she spoke, carried through the room with quiet clarity. "Thank you all for coming." Around her sat the key figures in the mystery that had shaken Wilmor Hollow. Hugh Brinley, pale and sullen, arms crossed. Reverend Falk, dignified but uneasy. Jenny sitting near the door, her eyes alert. Iris Pentlow, quiet, withdrawn, hands in her lap. Martha the cook, visibly uncomfortable. Inspector Redburn watching with arms folded. And finally Elsa Vale returned, after being summoned by police, her face a mask of reluctant composure. Miss Marple began without ceremony. "Clara Brinley did not collapse from poison," she said. "She collapsed from shock, because she saw someone approaching the blackboard while she wrote, someone who intended to silence her. A murmur stirred the room. "Let's begin with the chalk," she continued. "Clara wrote the words, 'Everything must go to—'" She was preparing to tell us that she had named her daughter Iris as the rightful heir to the Brinley estate and schoolhouse. Hugh Brinley shifted. "She had no child, everyone knows that." Miss Marple turned to him, eyes gentle. "Everyone believed that, because Clara ensured they did. She gave birth in secret. She placed Iris into foster care under the name Pentlow, likely hoping to protect her while hiding the scandal. Years later, when she tried to bring Iris back into her life, it was too late. Others had learned the truth, including someone who had much to lose. She turned to Elsa. "You, Miss Vale, were once Clara's friend, but something changed. When Celia, Iris's foster sister, discovered the truth, she went to Clara, and not long after, Celia disappeared." Elsa's lips tightened. "You're imagining things." "I think not. Celia had questions. Perhaps she demanded the truth be public. Perhaps she threatened exposure. And Clara, who had always been cautious, chose silence. Celia vanished. No police inquiry, no trace. But Clara never stopped mourning her. That much I'm certain of." Miss Marple retrieved a small object from her bag. "This locket," she said, holding it up, "was found behind a book in Clara's bedroom. Inside is a photograph of Celia, etched with her name." Clara kept her memory. Hidden, but close. Inspector Redburn took the locket and examined it without a word. "She planned to make things right," Miss Marple said. "Her will, though unsigned, named Iris as heir. She wrote the same intention in chalk on the blackboard, but someone in this room couldn't allow that." She faced the group. Poison was added to the guest teapot, not to a single cup, to the pot. Clara never drank hers. Hugh did, by accident, a small dose, not fatal. The intended victim was Clara. Elsa laughed once, short, sharp. "Why would I poison her? She was my friend." Miss Marple's voice was steady. "You had access, you knew the layout. And when Clara dismissed you last year, it was after you argued over Iris. Witnesses heard you. You believed Clara was about to rewrite history, make Iris her legal daughter, make Celia a martyr. You wanted it stopped." Elsa's face went still. "You can't prove anything." "But Clara can," Miss Marple said calmly. A pause. "She woke this morning, briefly. She identified the person who stood by the blackboard before she collapsed. She couldn't speak, but she pointed to the drawing hung behind her bed. A self-portrait of you, Miss Vale, done by one of your own students." The room was utterly silent. Miss Marple continued gently. "You wiped the chalkboard to erase the message. You tore the last 2 pages from her ledger. You thought you'd buried the truth, just as you buried Celia's memory." Elsa stood suddenly. "This is absurd." "She fled the village the morning after the incident," Redburn interrupted, stepping forward. "Didn't speak to police, didn't leave an address. Her hotel room held a discarded bottle with U extract traces. Forensics confirmed it this morning." Elsa's face blanched. "I didn't mean to kill her," she said quietly. "I just wanted her to stop." Miss Marple said nothing. "I gave her everything," Elsa added. "Years of loyalty, of friendship. Then she betrayed me. All for a girl she abandoned." "And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "that girl is the only one who loved her without expectation." Elsa didn't resist as Redburn gestured for an officer to escort her out. The room remained quiet long after she was gone. Reverend Falk bowed his head. Jenny sat with tears in her eyes, and Iris, for the first time, looked straight at Miss Marple. She was going to tell the truth. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and you must carry it forward." Outside, The mist had lifted. The schoolyard, once filled with children's laughter, stood still and golden under the setting sun. Miss Marple walked away from the school, her pace unhurried, the chill fading from her bones. The truth had not been silenced. It had simply waited, hidden in chalk, tucked in ledgers, folded inside lockets, until someone cared enough to look, and she always did.